All right, now I'd love to introduce our next speakers. Candelario Cervantez, head of the National Latinx Alliances at Teach for America. Candelario Cervantez is a business executive who opens educational opportunities to historically underrepresented and underserved communities and a champion for educational equity and excellence. Candelario is also a strong advocate of the promotion and advancement of diverse leaders in all industries. Currently, he is the head of the National Latinx Alliances on the National Public Partnerships and Government Affairs team at Teach for America. He is currently the president of Prospanica, formerly the National Society of Hispanic MBA's Dallas-Fort Worth board. The board focuses on the advancement of Latinx to executive level positions across all industries. And he will be joined in conversation by our own Rob Ribar here. So I will pass the mic to both of you. Thank you so much for taking time today to speak with us.
Rob, I think you're on mute.
Classic newbie problems. Well, thank you so much for being here. We had, the pleasure of hearing from you and Patricia, who just spoke also in our February summit as well. So I'm love to connect with you on a one-on-one basis for this conversation. As I said to you before we got online, my partner is also Latinx, and he's an educator as well. So this is a great opportunity for us. So yeah, I'd love to just hear a little bit more about yourself. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about where you're based in the world, if there's been any specific, COVID hobby maybe that you've picked up, but really more importantly, also about your career journey and how that journey that has taken you to Teach for America, how that journey also plays into the mission of TFA.
Thank you so much, Rob and Mariela, for the introduction. I'm so happy to be here and have this conversation with you all. So I'm Candelario Cervantes, and my pronouns are he, him, his, and él. I'm calling in from the ancestral lands of the Karankawan, Coalicacan, Atapec, Ishak, and Sana, or current day Houston, Texas. I have the privilege of being the head of our National Latinx Alliances here at TFA, or Teach for America. And I'm also the CEO of Art by Cervantes, and I'll get a little bit about that in this conversation. So a little bit about Teach for America. So we're one of the largest educational equity nonprofits and providers of diverse teachers in the US. We recruit, train, and place top talent in underserved low-income schools, where there's a commitment to teach for a minimum of 2 years because we're also a AmeriCorps program. So a little bit about my journey, and I think I like to also highlight Teach for America's theory of systemic change, because I think this was really played into my why. So, our work is, focused on centering our students and really working in community, right? So we know a lot of the work has to happen in the classroom, but we need all the industries and sectors working together to make the systemic changes in public education. And our view is who better than folks that have been in the classroom to understand what is going on to pull those levers, right? So if our core members or our teachers want to stay in the classroom beyond their 2-year commitment, awesome. Great. Here are the resources and tools so that you can continue being a leader at that capacity. But if you want to go into school and system leadership, elected office, healthcare, any other corporate position, great. Also, here are the resources and tools to continue being a leader at that capacity and fight for educational equity in those industries and sectors. So that's actually a big reason of my why and why I love working here, and I choose to work here, right? So a little bit about my story. So I always start my story. So my abuelitos, my grandparents, they came from Mexico around 1900 and settled in South Texas. And they always said, mijito, no tienes herencia, son, you don't have an inheritance. Your inheritance is your education, right? Because no one can take it away from you. And that was instilled in both of my parents. My mom was actually the first in our entire family to graduate and go to college. And I always tell her, thank you. Because I reflect back on this, right? she literally changed the trajectory of our entire family. And for a Latina to do that at that time in that space is kind of unheard of. So I always tell her thank you. My dad graduated from high school, but he was actually drafted into the Army. But prior to working in the Army, he worked at Southwestern Bell, which is now AT&T, as a lineman. The folks that would climb up the poles and put the wires. I even remember a story of him telling us, like, oh, they're now making us bury this thing called optic cable. And I was like, oh my gosh, Dad, like you literally were laying the groundwork for the internet, like literally, right? But because he had that level of education, when he went to the Army, he was actually put into telecom. And he always shares, that saved my life, right? Because otherwise I would have put in front infantry. So I always reflect on that, right? When we think about education. And for my story, I was actually tracked not to go to college. And fortunately, my family knew enough about the education system and how to navigate it that they were able to advocate alongside my teachers to be like, no, his scores are really high. He actually needs to go into honors classes, right? So fast forward, I was one of the first to graduate, or the first to graduate with honors, my entire family. And my family was like, oh, you're gonna be our doctor, right? Like not so much my parents, but my whole other family. And I was like, I didn't even get lawyer, engineer options, y'all. I was like, doctor. I'm like, oh, okay. I guess I'm going into this field. So that's what actually brought me to Houston, where I attended the University of St. Thomas. And, folks have asked me, what is the hardest thing you've ever done? And I was like, that first semester of college, that's actually the hardest thing I've ever done. Because it was there that I realized I was so ill prepared for the rigors of college, both academically and socially, right? This is the first time I met students with like real wealth and different access. And like, I just, didn't have that awareness. So I struggled mightily, but my teacher, Dr. Romani, she was my bio teacher, and she was the first person ever asked me, Candelario, what is it that you love to do? What is it that you want to do? And I was like, whoa, those are questions, right? And I told her, I really love to paint and I love doing studio artwork. And she was like, well, why are you doing this, right? There are all these other degrees and opportunities. And I just didn't know, right? And you just don't know what you don't know. So I leaned in and listened to her and built the relationships, which is inherent to, me, and I find a lot of our community members. And I actually ended up graduating with a bachelor's degree in business. And that business degree actually helped me secure my role working at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston here in development. And one of the things that one of the hiring managers said to me is like, we hired you because you actually had a business background, right? And I was like, oh my gosh. So it helped merge both of my passions, right? The art and the business. But at the same time, I'd also been teaching GED and adult-based education through Warren County Junior College via satellite office here while I was going to college. And, I always thought of my students, like, they were getting their GEDs in a month, right? And it's like, oh, it's not, something's wrong with our system, right? There's something structurally wrong because my students are graduating in their degrees. So that always stayed in my mind, right? But as I continued my career journey, I saw a lot of our directors had graduate degrees, and I was like, oh, I guess I got to get a graduate degree. Also, my mom had said, I just want you to do better and just get a master's degree. Like, not really expanding on what that meant. It was just a master's degree, right? So I was like, oh, okay, I guess I got to get this master's degree to advance. So I went back to St. Thomas, know what I know. And I went to our dean and I was like, I guess I got to get an MBA. Not really realizing maybe an MFA would have been good or others, but, I just went back to that space. And, I ended up grading my MBA. So I'm the first in our family to get a graduate degree, and even navigating that system was complicated. But the healthcare thing never went away. So I started looking. I'm here in Texas, right, in Houston, the world's largest medical center in Houston. So I looked to get into the medical center. So I started working there and doing international business development. And I served on the medical center's advisory board, which connected me to Rice University. And I found out they were doing a program there around MBAs for spine school principals. I'm like, oh my gosh, this just makes so much sense, right? Of course, our principals as CEO, giving them the same skills and tools that we do for our Fortune 1000, Fortune 100 CEOs. And that's actually how I got into educational equity work. And actually, let me back up. Recession happened around the same time, finally hit Houston. So this is about 2008. And they eliminated my role. And I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Right. So I actually took a step back and I was like really focused in on the rice program that really spoke to me, right? So I went back, took a step back, and then I helped I applied for the operations coordinator, and we helped relaunch that program with a new executive director. So I was on the ground floor of launching this new venture. And that's actually when I found out about Teach for America and our alums, because they made a perfect pipeline for the program. I just had never heard of the org, but I fell in love with the students and the alums that came through at Rice. And, you know, I had intended at staying at Rice because I had advanced to an assistant director in at the business school. And, you know, life happens. My partner got into a graduate degree program in Dallas. And it's one of the top programs in clinical psychology. So I'm going to brag on Andrea a little bit. You know, I told her, you're not going to turn that down. I guess I'm traveling. We're going to move to Dallas. And, you know, I had already made my mind up that I wanted to continue doing this work. So I looked at Teach for America. I knew the vision and the organization. And that's how I entered working at Teach for America. I entered working in the region. And it was there that I really got to see what we were doing on the ground, training our teachers, and what we were doing in partnership with the communities. And I navigated through the system. And now I serve as our head of our National Latinx Alliances. And I think every day I say it's a true privilege to do this work because, you know, a lot of the work that we focus in on here is, you know, leveraging your full identity as your power, right? Doing the identity development work, doing the DEI trainings, because before I never had that time to do that, but we did it here. And that really did help open my eyes to DEI and all the earned privileges and unearned privileges that I held, right? So that really did start making me think a little bit more on like, what can I do to continue to give back, right? And what can I do to continue to make it easier for the next person? And also getting all the vocabulary, academic speak on my own lived experience through K-12, right? I was like, oh my gosh, that's right. Like, this is why I struggled so mightily. And oh yeah, we're severely underrepresented in all these industries and sectors. Just looking back at my own career path, I was always one of the only Latinx folks in those rooms, in those spaces. So that's a big focus that I do think a lot about, especially when we put that lens into the Latinx community. You know, only 8% of teachers identify as Latinx in public schools, about 7% are principals, and then less than 2% are in superintendent roles. And then if you look at the boards, maybe 4%. So if you compare that, I think, to what Patricia was elevating, like, yeah, also in the corporate sector, we're severely underrepresented in all these industries and sectors, you know, and our kids can't be what they don't see. So a big piece of the work is how do we help increase the diversity of our teaching workforce, because that is the first connection that our students see. So really putting that lens into our work, and, you know, have the privilege to work with national Latinx organizations that are really helping our community reach their full educational, economic, and social potential. And I think about that a lot in my own work because, you know, my own lived experience, I didn't even know these organizations existed, or I found out way too late.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's what's so key that you said there too is like you can, you know, starting that diversity with teachers, and then, you know, people can become principals, they can become superintendents. And I think one thing we've seen during this pandemic especially is how interconnected all these different things are, because the board has a huge role in that. A local town legislature can have a huge role in that. And then of course, when you get to like the federal level, and all of these things are kind of interconnected, and you need that diversity at every level, because, you know, that's the way we're really going to solve these problems. So I really kind of like thinking of that as like, you know, it starts on that kind of ground level with the teachers, and then we need to start making that change, or we, you know, simultaneously, really, we need to start making that change at the, you know, highest levels as well.
And elevating the voices of our folks that are most proximate, right? I think so many times we don't do that as legislators and policy folks, as leaders of large organizations, like, and stop and ask. And I think a lot of the work that we also do is like, elevate the voices of our students. Something I always say is like, folks say, our students are our future. I'm like, no, actually our students are our present. Their voices are powerful. It's our jobs as adults to remove the adult barriers so that we can elevate their voices and actually listen to their perspectives.
I love that. That kind of reminds me, when LinkedIn was trying to decide what they wanted to do with their employees um, during the pandemic, they decided ultimately that they're going to let their employees choose where they want to go, whether they want to work hybrid, whether they want to work in the office, whether they want to be fully remote. And what they said is like, we trust you. And I think that's something that's often even not said to students is like, hey, we trust you. We want to hear your feedback. You are, yes, maybe in some cases you're a minor, but you also have a valuable opinion that should be conveyed. Thank you so much for sharing your story. I mean, that was really wonderful, fascinating. It also shows to our community that there's not one way to reach a goal. So many of us zig and zag throughout our careers. I started in the theater and went into events, and now in community. My partner, who is an educator, actually started running an LGBTQ center and is now helping run a middle school in New York City. But you talked a lot about your college experience, and that it can obviously be a very confusing time for lots of people. Definitely, so many of us don't get the proper preparation for that. So I'd love to see if you could talk a little bit more about how TFA is helping Latinx students succeed in college, maybe even getting into college, but certainly then once you're in that college experience and then going to be moving into the real world, what kind of role you all are playing in that?
Yeah, I think something like I mentioned earlier with the work we're doing for our Latinx Alliance is specifically, we've been partnering with national organizations. Again, like my first promise to the partners and collaborators is that I want to make sure that we're increasing the awareness of you and your organization and your resources to the broader community, right? So that our students know that these opportunities are available, right? Before it's too late. Like my own journey, right? I didn't even know that there was Prosmanica existed, and they give graduate scholarships with the Hispanic Scholarship Fund to also give graduate scholarships. It's like, what? I just found out way too late. So our hope is to really, truly partner with our partners to bring in those resources, starting with our educators and then through our communities, right? And I think that's a big piece of the work. But the other big part of the work, it's elevating the voices of our communities. So it's in partnership and true partnership of our national alliances that we hear their perspectives on what we need to make sure that we're voicing, leveraging our voice and leveraging Teach for America's position, right? To continue to elevate those voices, especially in our policy positions. Like, where do we need to elevate? What do we need to say, right? What are the things that, we need to navigate? Or where are the spaces that we're not in that maybe we should be in, right? So I think it's that true partnership and community that we've been focusing in on. Moreover, I think I dropped in some information about our Latinx Alliances. So again, the other thing is that we've been trying to make sure that there's a partner for every stage of someone's career in life, right? Because as I speak to executives, they're like, I need help too, because I'm the first, right? I'm the only. I think what they should elevate it, only 4% are executives in Fortune 100, Fortune 1000 companies. Yet we are the large, growing demographic. And then if you put that lens onto our students, about 25% of students are Latinx. We're now emerging probably around 30% will be given the new data. So knowing this, yet only 8% of our educators are identified as Latinx. So I think those are the different things that we're having the conversations with our partners. And then you asked about the college access piece. So building the partnerships with organizations such as the Association of Latino Professionals for America, right? They're creating chapters on campuses to not only help students get to college, but through college, right? By building the sense of familia, community, so that they can also navigate the systems. Other great partner, Excelencia for Education, they've just been such an amazing collaborator. They've done so much research on what works for Latinx students, right? Making sure that we're getting that information out into the campuses, because they're not just highlighting HSI works or Hispanic serving institutions, but all universities. Like, what is working? What are those bright spots? Because I think what we've seen through the pandemic, yes, we had gains, right? Which were amazing. But now with the pandemic hitting, we're actually seeing a number of students dropping out or not returning to college because of all the things that the pandemic has disproportionately impacted our community, right? Caregivers are passed away, their jobs, they're now having to take on jobs to work. We've seen this in K-12 as well, right? So thinking through that lens, like how do we continue to support our community members so that they can get to and through college, advance. And I always think like, it's not only college. I'm with Secretary Castillo on, all the options, right? Like technical schools, different areas that you can move economically. I think these are all the things, but if you don't know, you don't know, right?
Yeah. And I think the key word I kept hearing you say too is conversation, is communication. And I think, as you've mentioned just now, there's been many, incredibly devastating things to happen during the pandemic. But I think one bright spot is that it has improved our access to conversation and communication. I know on a local level where I am, I wasn't often, I don't have children, so I often wasn't going to go attending a Board of Ed meeting, but now I can call in, you can join from Zoom, you can have these other ways to get, as you just said, information about these programs out beyond, a piece of mail. Or even an email that can be easily deleted. You can have events like this one to really have a conversation. But in order to do that, you do have to have access to technology. And that's something else I wanted to ask you about because, where I live in upstate New York, they recently did a poll, huge amounts of people that don't have access to broadband, not only just able to afford it, but even that basic access. And I know that's been something that really hasn't been talked about as we had a year of homeschooling in many places in the United States. So can you tell us a little bit more about this imbalance, this digital divide in both the United States, and if you know anything else about it in the world at large?
Thank you for the question. I think this is something, this pandemic has shined a bright light, right? A bright light on all the inequities that we have been talking about for decades now. So now you can't turn away. So I think the question on the digital divide has been one of those issues, right? We've been elevating. Our CEO, Elisa Villanueva always says like, technology and internet, it's like your pen and paper, like now, right? And we knew at the beginning of the pandemic, we had about 17 million homes without high-speed internet, and then about 7 million of family members didn't have computers at home. So we were able to pivot quickly. And I think that was something that was very interesting, right? In that moment, we were able to pivot and get the resources out, hotspots delivered. But we had been talking about this for some time prior. So because of the pandemic, we were able to accelerate different things that met the needs of our students, and then even putting a lens on our students with disabilities, right? Like even the interventions, different ways that we were able now to provide services where historically we hadn't been able to do or hadn't been able to do, right? We are now being able to do that. So now looking through this lens, what are the things, knowing that the education system was not built for communities of color or communities from low-income backgrounds, right? Like the system was never good enough for us, right? Like how do we now use what we've done now and learned to continue moving those things forward? Like what do we keep doing that we didn't do prior? So really thinking through that lens. And I also went ahead and chatted in some resources because again, it's about elevating the stories of our community members. And I think this is the things that we focus in on even in our congressional work is getting the stories of our educators, getting to see our stories of our caregivers and our students on the digital divide. What is their perspective? What is their lens? What is their lived experiences? Because I think a lot of this work is hearts and minds. So once we personalize the numbers, because we have the stats, we have always had the numbers, but I think it's when you personalize it, we actually see the traction. So that's something that we've been doing and will continue to do. But yeah, please use those links, use those stories. And Rob, I'm really happy that you did elevate like New York, right? I think we put a lot of focus on our urban cities, but it's our rural communities, our native indigenous communities that have been disproportionately impacted by this, right? Because there is not even access to broadband. Yes. There is no broadband, right? But even like, in Silicon Valley, Santa Clara County, San Jose schools, like just outside Silicon Valley, right? Like where are the tech hubs, like our communities don't have access to the broadband. So I think there's multiple things. But I think from our network, from our alums that have taken on a lot of the challenges during the pandemic, we have one alum that ran a whole organization on CompuDob in Houston here, where they were giving out computers to students, right? Secretary Garcia also elevated the nonprofit spaces have been picking up different pieces where, we just haven't had the space or pieces of it. But I think those are things that we're seeing that our network has been working on.
Yeah. And I think the other, thing that it also makes me think of is, and I had talked to another subject matter expert about this in another summit, is that there can often be this thought that, okay, Gen Z, they're all digital natives, hand them the computer, they're done, they're great, but one, not everyone learns the same way, just as, millennials or baby boomers, some people are great at computers, some people aren't. And then, as you just said, someone who might have only had access to a computer for, a few hours a day at the library or at school, if you're then handing them a laptop to work from home, like that person might not know how to use that. So I think, would you agree that kind of training, not just the raw materials, but also that training needs to be part of it too?
Definitely. And we saw a lot of our community partners do this work. Unidos US's affiliates had different affiliates that were doing different trainings for caregivers. Like, this is how you use your computer. Like, this is how you turn it, but not just for our students, but also the caregivers. But I think the economic piece that we're also seeing is that we're actually building the skills, right? And the resources so that now our caregivers can actually go for these different jobs or online, or what we saw in New York and some other cities, where the first time they've had a hotspot, folks can actually apply online for jobs because everything is online now, where that wasn't even an option. So not even just like the access to our students' education piece, but also the entire family, the entire household, we're seeing increases. So I think it's just, I think we just have to keep having these conversations and pushing it forward and not letting it go back into the shadows, right? Continue having that bright light on all these pieces.
Yeah. Well, before we run out of time, I want to thank you for shining this bright light on this today. And, I definitely encourage everyone to look at the links that we put in the chat. But can you tell us before we wrap up here, how else can people get involved in TFA, or are there certain timelines that they should be aware of if they want to get involved?
Yeah, thanks so much. Well, one thing, I know that we have a global audience. So I wanted to highlight our sibling organization, Teach for All. We're actually having a global conference on education next week. It's open, free, so please attend. But yeah, follow us, visit our website, Latinx Alliances at Teach for America, where there's a resource hub there, and follow us on our social at TFA Latinx and TFA La Familia on Facebook, and on LinkedIn, Teach for America Latinx Alliances. And feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn as well. Just send me a note that we met here at Power to Fly.
Wonderful. And we'll share on our own social or in our post-event email also the link to your own summit next week, just so everyone is aware of it. But thank you so much for your time today. What an enlightening conversation. Again, thank you for shining the light on these important topics that, as you said, the one highlight of the pandemic is that these things that have, long been fissures in our society are now kind of finally, the spotlight is being shown on them. And hopefully, with leaders like yourself and, many other leaders that we're having speaking at the summit are, finding solutions to these longstanding problems.
Thank you all so much for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you both for the thoughtful conversation. I was writing some notes down. Educational equity. Yes, yes, yes. I don't know if you all tuned in earlier, but I had mentioned I'm in Argentina, here in San Martin de los Andes, the original lands of the Mapuche people. We went to El Bozón to a alternative education encuentro. And I proposed this question of how do you all who are facilitators in alternative education use or choose to use or not use technology in the space where you're trying to do something alternative. So I love that you're bringing up this question of, the digital divide and how to bring visibility. You mentioned a quote here that I wrote down, they can't be what they can't see. So, leveraging your full identity to empower your work. I love that you mentioned that as well. You dropped so much knowledge today. Best of luck. I used to live in Houston, Texas, and I know that we've got a lot of work to do out there. So stay strong And I invite everyone who's listening to connect and to support the great work that you're doing. So thank you.